One of my mantras is bad news fast, good news slow. The tendency is to run and go tell your boss how great things are and to hold on to that bad information just a little bit longer. And as a leader, you need the opposite to happen. And the way the opposite happens is by building trust with people. You need to build those relationships. You need to build that trust. And I think it's the foundation of how you build a successful team.
Hello, this is Shawn Budde of Ensemble X, and this is the Ensemble X Exchange podcast. Today I'm joined by Matt Potere, the relatively new CEO of Happy Money, about how he approached his first 90 days on the job. Happy Money is a consumer finance platform dedicated to helping people achieve their financial goals by connecting them with responsible lending solutions. With over 25 years of experience in consumer finance, Matt has led companies like Sunlight Financial, which he took public in 2021. Previously, he led the home equity and auto products division at Bank of America. Beyond his professional achievements, Matt is a community advocate, a proud husband, and a father of two. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Shawn.
So rumor has it that you recently started learning guitar.
I did. A couple years ago, my wife got me a guitar for Christmas. And so I've been playing on my own a little bit, and I take lessons every week. It's safe to say I am not only the oldest student, but I am older than most of the students' parents.
Nice.
Ton of fun.
Are you doing this at School of Rock or?
It feels like that a little bit. I have to make way for the student right after me. He usually comes in like a Minecraft t-shirt.
Nice.
And is about 40 years younger than me. But it's super fun. It's a great experience.
I mean, I assume you in some way expressed a desire to learn the guitar. She didn't spontaneously decide you should.
Yes. I have plenty of faults, but she didn't think my lack of guitar ability was one of them. So I've never been incredibly musically inclined, but it was one of those things that I thought would be a fun thing to learn. And it's been great. A little bit humbling, but definitely a ton of fun. And I just doing it. Clearly, at this point, I'm just doing it for my enjoyment, but it's been great.
Yeah, I mean, so actually, maybe not in Charlotte, but in Chicago here, there are School of Rock sessions, and several of my friends have gone and joined bands, and they'll play 3 or 4 times a year. So, well, welcome to the show, Matt. Let's dive in. You started your career at MBNA, and then you were at Bank of America. What do you think are the advantages of working for a big bank like that?
Yeah, so first, for anyone who knows anything about MBNA, it was an incredible place to work. And I like to say I grew up there professionally. First and foremost, the culture was really strong, truly, genuinely focused on people, focused on customers, and focused on the community. These weren't slogans on the wall. This is really how everyone lived those values. Secondly, it was a very operationally focused business. And so everyone knew our core business was lending. And you could take a credit report and sit down with our CEO and walk through the applicant and talk about ability, stability, and willingness to pay. So that foundation was really powerful.
Yeah.
It's the old adage of it's easy to lend money. It's getting paid back. That's the hard part. And we also learned how to be collectors. I spent plenty of time with a headset strapped on, collecting on loans that went the wrong way on us. And so that foundational experience really set me up in the way that I think about credit and financial services companies more broadly.
Yeah, I remember Ray Peloso had worked at MBNA. If I remember correctly, he told me once a week, the management team got on the phones for an hour, and if they didn't out-collect the collections team, they had to buy pizza for everyone. And I have to say, it's a great angle and probably unique to MBNA, relatively speaking, because I can tell you at Citibank, all our operations were hundreds of miles at the least, sometimes thousands of miles away from the head office. I used to take people out to Sioux Falls, once a quarter, because I think in an organization of that size, you really just don't appreciate how complex it is in the operations. You sit at almost every customer service terminal and there's like 20 Post-it notes around because we decided not to code something in the system and they just have to remember, like, if you're talking to someone in California, don't do this. So I really appreciate that, connecting to the operations side of the business. How was Bank of America different? How was that experience different? What'd you learn there?
Yeah, so when I joined Bank of America in 2010, it was right after the bank had acquired Countrywide. Some pretty well-publicized challenges. And so I had a sort of a ringside seat to all of that and was fortunate enough to be able to work pretty closely through some of those challenges. I ran strategy for the home loans division at that time. So it was a really interesting experience, very different in many ways than MBNA. I'd say, Bank of America is, a much larger, systemically important institution. And so it fills a different role. So it was a very different experience, but I learned a tremendous amount. These big financial institutions fit into our broader economy and can have a really strong impact on the economy, or when things go wrong, can have a really negative impact. And so it was definitely a bit of a humbling experience. And it, I think, put customers in the right, or put what we do in the right context.
You then made a transition to Fintech, to Sunlight. So what was that transition like?
Yeah, so I had actually done a small business lending startup between MBNA and Bank of America.
Oh, okay.
Bank of America actually acquired MBNA. I was there for a little while,
Right.
and I did the startup, then I went back to Bank of America. So I had the opportunity to work at a very small company as we ramped it up in the small business lending space. And then when I joined Sunlight in 2015, I had a bit of the same experience. We certainly grew Sunlight quite a bit larger, and ultimately we took it public in 2021. The thing that's really fun at a small growth company is everyone's involved in the same mission. Everyone's driving forward together. When you get into a room, what matters is that the best idea wins. It doesn't matter if it's your idea. At a larger company, if your idea wins and it's not best for the company, you may still really benefit from that.
Yep.
That's not the case in a small company. We all rise or fall together. And it's a lot of fun. You get to, back to my example of pulling up a credit report, you do a lot of that type of work when you're at a smaller growth-oriented company. And I love it. I love building companies. I love solving the challenges that go with it. And I love the diversity of work, which happens a ton when you're at a small company.
Yeah.
It's just, big companies, you can specialize and be a mile deep and an inch wide. Smaller companies and growth companies just can't have that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that makes Ensemble X unique is that my partner Mike and I both had the experience of working in big companies. We say we learned a lot of disciplines. We worked in startups, so you learn how to be kind of nimble and maybe take more pragmatic approaches. And then we'd both done consulting, so we know how to get in and have an impact relatively quickly. So can you talk about what do the big banks get right, and what carries over into fintech for you versus what do you maybe learn in fintech that would be applicable to the big banks?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, and I agree with how you describe it. Spending your early part of a career at a larger institution teaches you some of the key disciplines, requires you to be able to communicate your ideas. When you're at a bigger company, you've got to be able to communicate across the organization to inspire people. You need to make sure they understand what you're doing. You have to think about things in a more balanced way. And that's really valuable, because sometimes when you're at a smaller startup company, it's about raw execution, and you forget about what you're building to, and that there's a world that exists outside of your institution. Especially for a company like Happy Money, where we partner with depositories, we're working all the time with credit unions and credit funds, and credit unions in particular. They're heavily regulated institutions.
Yeah.
Having been at organizations where I've spent hours and hours and hours of my time with regulators and understanding the importance of managing risk and how it can impact the institution, it's incredibly valuable. It's not all about growth. It's about being structured and disciplined and having good processes, and taking that to a smaller company, especially a financial services company, I think is really valuable. And you have to have both, because ultimately, if you want to scale, you need to have the right process in place, and you need to make sure you understand the challenges that your partners are dealing with.
Yeah. So what's been interesting to me, I started my own business when I was 27, 28, and it just didn't take. And everybody at the time told me, you're way too young to be starting a business. And now we see people coming out of college, and going straight into a startup, and they don't learn kind of those disciplines that you learn in a large organization. I think many of them are kind of silly. Many of them are pretty valuable. And so I think one thing I've heard that you say is many fintechs don't realize that they're fintechs with a capital F and a lowercase t. I say that 90% of fintechs are 100% tech. Those sound maybe like they're a contradiction. I suspect actually we're saying the same thing. Can you kind of share what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. Now, there are certain fintechs that are true financial technology. They're technology platforms that are there to help support financial services companies. But many companies that label themselves fintech don't realize that that's not what they are. They're actually at fundamentally lending institutions. They're either lending directly on their own balance sheet, or they're lending through their partners' balance sheets. In either way, the lending piece and the core competencies around credit and risk management are incredibly important. And so this mindset of I'm a fintech, I just grow really fast,
Right.
The Silicon Valley mindset, I don't think it's healthy if you're a financial services company, especially if you're partnering with depositories or other regulated institutions. You need to manage risk in the way that they need to manage risk. And I think sometimes, quote unquote, fintechs get a little bit caught up in that tech. They want the big valuations of being a tech company, and they forget about the core competencies of being a financial services company. Sometimes, I've said this over the last few years, but I think it's true. Domino's has an app. That doesn't make them a technology company.
Right.
They're not pizza tech. They're still a pizza company. They're technology enabled. And so when you look at companies like Happy Money, technology is incredibly important. It allows what we do to be more efficient and give customers a better experience than they could otherwise get. And so that's valuable for depositories. But we don't forget that the core competency is that we're fundamentally a consumer finance business. And so lending and risk management really matters.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've encountered is there's a lot of folks who seem to believe, they start these companies believing that if they create a great customer experience, customers will just pay, that some sort of magic will happen, that customers who wouldn't pay, someone else will. And I don't want to discount positive selection from a good experience, from an easy onboarding, all that stuff. But it is necessary, but not sufficient. And to your point, I think there's very few businesses now in the world that don't require some technology. It's necessary, like I say, but not sufficient. So having come from a big bank in the past, were there things that you had to unlearn, like things that you knew that you had to stop knowing?
Yeah. So, I will say I grew up, my dad was an entrepreneur. He owned a gas station. I used to pump gas from the time I was very young. Probably, I think the statute of limitations has left, but I'm sure we were violating a child labor law somewhere. But I learned really early on that no one is going to solve your problems when you're an entrepreneur, but you. Too many times it would be Saturday night and the family's about to go out to dinner and my dad gets a phone call and the guy who was supposed to pump gas Saturday night doesn't show up. My dad wasn't planning on pumping gas on Saturday night, but guess who pumped gas? Because that's what you do when you're an entrepreneur. And so I had this ingrained in me from when I was, very, very young.
Interesting.
Even when I was at MBNA, I helped start MBNA Canada, and we went through an incredible growth stage. And so it was a startup, but it was a corporate startup. You never worried about being funded. You had plenty of support from the broader company. But Saturday nights, I can remember at the end of the month processing credit cards and literally going through the final steps of opening the accounts and keying in customers' names and doing QA, 11 o'clock on a Saturday night at the end of the month so we could hit our goal. So I've had a lot of fortunate experiences to bring that with me to smaller growth companies. And, that's certainly different than a lot of these bigger companies.
Yeah. When we started Zest AI, we all worked the phones.
Yeah.
Calls weren't flooding in at the time. You just had to be kind of on duty. But it really gives you a very different perspective, on things and really connected us to customers, which I thought was a great experience. What was tough for us is what we had to unlearn. My partner came from Google. I came from Capital One and Citibank, is we were taking, I'd say, very elegant approaches that were not exactly capital efficient at times. And we had to really unlearn that kind of beautiful, elegant test that you can get away with in a large organization was not so great when you had to go raise money every 12 months and you had to show, I think, visible progress upon at least one dimension. So why don't we talk about the transition to Happy Money? How long have you been in the role now?
About 90 days.
All right. And what brought you to Happy Money?
I spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to do in the next phase of my career. And I looked at all kinds of opportunities, everything from trading investment tax credits to creating a startup studio, you name it, I looked at it. And I really wanted to be thoughtful about what I do in this next phase. By, I would say, late spring, what I decided I really wanted to do was start a consumer finance business. And I see a couple of big trends. One is for depositories, they're good at gathering deposits. Consumers trust them to hold on to those deposits and keep them safe for good reason. But increasingly, they're challenged to grow assets. Having that branch on the corner today is not as valuable as it was 30 years ago. People don't just walk in there to get a mortgage.
Yeah.
And so how they leverage and how they use those deposits is increasingly challenging for depositories. And so I wanted to build a platform that could help originate high quality assets across the credit spectrum and a wide range of consumer products, and fund them with depositories as well as credit funds. And we're seeing increasingly credit funds and asset managers are getting access to other sources of capital, and they need fixed income assets to be able to put that capital to work. So I saw this big trend. I decided this is really what I was meant to go do. I've spent my whole career in and around this space, and I was ready to go. And then I met the team at BlackRock and TrueStage who funded the Happy Money business. And they were looking for a CEO, and it was the perfect opportunity for me to be able to step into something with a great platform and a great team and great partnerships to be able to grow and build what I ultimately wanted to build, but accelerates that vision by a few years.
Right.
So it was one of those right place at the right time. And I honestly couldn't be happier to be here. No pun intended.
I mean, it's awesome that, yeah, you said this is what I want to do, and then that the opportunity arose. So I've come in as CEO of a company from outside, and it's pretty overwhelming at first. So I'm curious, how did you structure that? How have you approached your first 90 days in the role?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I was fortunate with is I think two things. One is I've spent my whole career in and around the consumer finance space. At my prior company, we funded $10 billion in loans, primarily through relationships with credit unions. And so that funding model is very similar to the funding model that we have at Happy Money. And so I understood the relationships and the funding model. So I had that going for me when I stepped in. I also had a vision for what could be before I started. And so I think I started with a little bit of a leg up in that regard. That said, the first 90 days is about digging in, understanding the details, understanding the team, and understanding our capabilities and getting out and meeting our partners. So that's how I've spent a lot of my 90 days trying to lay out that vision of where we want to go, make sure that we have the right resources in the right places to be able to go execute on it and go deliver. And that's what I've been focused on.
Are you guys a fully virtual team or partially virtual?
We're fully virtual. So I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have teammates all over the country.
That feels like it makes it harder to kind of connect and come into the organization.
In some ways it makes it harder, in some ways it doesn't. So there's not an office that I can walk around, but the company is remarkably good at creating relationships and working virtually. The collaborative tools that we use, the way in which sort of meeting routines and the way in which people interact to some degree makes that easier. But in other ways, it is harder that I can't just walk around an office and sit across the table from people. I'm also very intentional about getting to know people and getting together in person. In my first 90 days, already a few times we've been together in person. We'll actually be together in person again next week in LA so that we can bring the executive team together, make sure that we're all aligned, we're developing the relationships, and then bringing teammates who are local together to do some social events and build our culture and get to know each other. It causes us to be more intentional.
Yeah.
And that's really important. The big advantage of being virtual is we can recruit across the country. And that's a real advantage. So it's got its advantages and its disadvantages, but I do think we do a pretty good job.
Yeah. When I was at Capital One, we were part virtual because we didn't have the desk space. And what it made me realize is that I was much more connected to people who basically were between my office and the bathroom. Right. And so those are the people I would pass by. And so I'd talk to them, and I had 4 floors of the building. I kind of intentionally would at least walk around each floor every day if I had the time. But once I think we had a terrible system. It was probably Jabber or something like that. But at least I could look down that list and say, I haven't talked to Matt in a while. I should probably chat with him. And also it was asynchronous, right? If I'd walked by your desk, you didn't happen to be there, we just wouldn't talk. So I'm a fan of the virtual tools. It's got to be an interesting experience. So I've never come into an organization that was fully virtual. We're fully virtual, but we kind of all know each other more or less before we joined. And we also do the same thing. We try to get together in person a few times a year. All right, well, let me get you out of here on this. Like, what advice do you have for someone else coming into kind of your situation in an organization in terms of, you're there to change something, right? How do you lead that change while also respecting the past and what the organization has stood for?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's really important is to spend time truly getting to know people for who they are. It's the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I believe that to be very true. And so getting to know the team, spending real time where you build trust. When you step in as a CEO, one of the hard things about being a CEO is all of the information you get is filtered, and everyone who's talking to you has some angle. And that doesn't mean that their angle is nefarious.
Yep.
But everyone is coming at it from their own perspective. And so what's really important is that you build trust where people know that they can raise issues to you very quickly. One of my mantras is bad news fast, good news slow. The tendency is to run and go tell your boss how great things are and to hold on to that bad information just a little bit longer. And as a leader, you need the opposite to happen. And the way the opposite happens is by building trust with people, making sure that they can see that we're on a journey here to get better. And that's not ever going to end. It's continuous. And so you need to build those relationships. You need to build that trust. And I think it's the foundation of how you build a successful team.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I did when I ran a large organization at Capital One is I would take a junior group of people out to lunch every Monday. And I'll tell you, one time we rode over in this woman's van and we're sitting there looking at the menus, before we get started. And she finally just says, okay, I just need to know, are we getting fired? And it really, I mean, for one, I'm like, I wouldn't ride over in your van if I was
never get back.
I was going to fire you. And someone from HR, like if I call you into my office and there's someone from HR, then you need to worry. But it was just a reminder of, that those layers create a distance, right? And that distance creates some anxiety for people. I totally agree with you. We filter, right? Everybody has kind of their angle on how they're hearing something. And to get a deeper understanding, you really need to go deeper into the organization. So that's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today, Matt. So thank you for that. And for the rest of you, you can follow Ensemble X and Matt Potere. That's Potere on LinkedIn. You can visit us at ensemblex.com, and you can find the Ensemble X Exchange podcast on all major platforms. Thank you for listening.